after you would receive the box of material and you would go through it and determine what was relevant for your purposes, how did you use that machine?
There would be times when there was nothing relevant in the box and we wouldn't take any pictures. This is a camera, of course. This is a copy stand. These lights light up the base of it. A document in this fashion would be photographed thus.
In the Senate of the United States, a resolution to establish a select committee of the Senate to conduct an investigation and study of the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any persons, acting individually or in combination with others, in the presidential election of 1972, or any campaign, canvass, or other activity related to it. From Washington, NPAC brings you gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of today's hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here is NPAC correspondent Jim Lehrer.
Good evening. Political espionage is a routine way of life in American politics, and everybody in the business knows it, accepts it, and engages in it. This was the concise, matter-of-fact message today from Nixon campaign spy John R. Buckley, alias Fat Jack, in his testimony before the Urban Committee. Buckley, a 53-year-old former FBI agent, congressional investigator, and federal poverty official, said he recruited a Washington taxi driver to assist in surreptitiously borrowing and then photographing Edmund Muskie campaign documents in the 1972 election. The photographs were then turned over to a Nixon campaign official or to Watergate figure E. Howard Hunt, alias Ed Warren. In addition to explaining the various techniques he used in accomplishing all of this, Buckley laid out his firm belief that what he did was perfectly proper and all part of the game of politics. Buckley resisted efforts from the senators to get him to say he was sorry. Buckley said his conscience was clear, and that's that. But as you will see, in the process of today's short session, just over 2 hours in all, Buckley and the committee raised once again some of the crucial questions involved in how political campaigns are conducted in this country. John R. Buckley also had an additional significance for the committee staff. It is only vaguely referred to in the course of the hearing today, but Peter Kay is prepared now to make it more specific.
One matter that the committee does not explore today in its interrogation of John Buckley was his role in instigating an investigation of Chief Committee Investigator Carmine Bellino. Last summer, the Republican National Chairman George Bush charged that Bellino had masterminded political espionage, including electronic surveillance, of Republican presidential nominee Richard Nixon back in 1960. Now, Bellino vigorously denies this charge, and a three-member subcommittee headed by Senator Herman Talmadge is investigating the whole matter. The roots of the Bush allegation apparently lie in information provided by Buckley at the request of Jairus Leonard, former head of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. Just what Buckley and Leonard's role in the whole thing is, we don't know right now. Buckley today invoked the attorney-client relationship in refusing to go into it, and Senator Lowell Weicker, who was probing the matter, said he would not go any further until the Talmadge subcommittee reports back. Jim?
All right, we'll be back at the close of tonight's broadcast to discuss some of the issues raised by Buckley's testimony. With me then to provide all the answers will be Mike McClister, a Washington-based political consultant who as a professional has participated in political campaigns at the local, state, and national level. Now to the hour-by-hour look at the committee's short day. In the first hour, Buckley details what he obtained from his agent in the Muskie office, including press releases, internal memos, and speech drafts. Buckley says there was no conflict with his job at the Office of Economic Opportunity because he would rendezvous with his spy during his lunch hour. In hour two, Buckley says he has no idea how you can prohibit political espionage because it is so hard to define. And he cites other problems, noting that news leaks indicate there are thousands of spies in the executive branch. In the short third hour, Buckley testifies that he has no problem with his conscience because of his actions. That provoked some sharp words from Senator Ervin. The chairman got in late this morning, and it was Senator Baker who brought the session to order.
The committee will come to order. The chairman has been unavoidably detained and will be here shortly. Senator Inouye asked me to indicate that the Commerce Committee is in executive session today and that he has the responsibility for a number of bills that are being considered in that session. The chairman should be here within the next 15 to 30 minutes, and at that time I will have to leave in order to manage amendments to the strip mine bill on the floor of the Senate. The witness has now arrived, and before we proceed with that, I understand counsel has an affidavit that he wishes to present for the record at this time.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. In accordance with our Rule 26, which reads that any person whose name is mentioned or is specifically identified who believes that testimony or other evidence presented at a public hearing or comment made by the committee member or counsel tends to defame or otherwise adversely affect his reputation may either request to appear personally or file a sworn affidavit of facts relevant to the testimony. Mr. Mitchell Rogovin, counsel for the Institute of Policy Studies, has under this rule submitted an affidavit which I'd like Mr. Vice Chairman to read into the record. It's an affidavit of Mitchell Rogovin made in the City of Washington, District of Columbia. Mitchell Rogovin, being duly sworn, deposes and says, 1. I am a partner in the law firm of Arnold & Porter, 1229 19th Street, Northwest Washington, D.C., a member of the Bar of District of Columbia and General Counsel to the Institute of Policy Studies, hereinafter referred to as the Institute. 2. The Institute is a nonprofit District of Columbia corporation which is exempt from federal income tax under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1954 as a charitable and educational organization, and which is not a, quote, private foundation, unquote, under the code. The Institute engages in research into public policy matters and is engaged in the training and education of individuals through its PhD program. The Institute engages in no, quote, political activities, unquote, that are forbidden under the Internal Revenue laws. 3. In testimony before the Senate Select Committee on presidential campaign activities on Wednesday, September 26, 1973, Mr. Patrick Buchanan, in the course of his testimony, made several false allegations concerning the Institute. 4. In his testimony, Mr. Buchanan stated that the Ford Foundation, quote, provides funds, unquote, for the Institute for Policy Studies, that the Institute was a, quote, beneficiary of Ford money, unquote, and that the Institute, quote, of course, is Ford-funded, unquote. Mr. Buchanan sought to leave the impression that the Institute's funding has come primarily or in large part from the Ford Foundation. 5. In fact, the only funds the Institute has received from the Ford Foundation consisted of a one-year grant of $7,800 received in 1964 for the specific purpose of holding seminars on the subject of the Alliance for Progress. This grant was a very minor source of funding for the Institute. 6, Mr. Buchanan stated that the Institute, quote, holds seminars for congressmen, for staffers, and the like, and they, the Institute, deal in trying to influence congressmen and the like to vote in one direction, end of quote. 7, in fact, the Institute has held conferences and seminars which have been attended by, among others, congressmen and their assistants, but at no time has the Institute attempted to influence the votes of congressmen. 8, Mr. Buchanan asserted that the Institute, quote, funded the Quicksilver Times, end of quote, which he described as, quote, radical underground newspaper, unquote, quote, which has a political point of view and which is sold for profit, end of quote. Mr. Buchanan stated further that since he was familiar with the Quicksilver Times as a, quote, commercial venture, it would seem to me that this alleged funding by the Institute would be an illicit use of tax-exempt funds, end of quote. In the same sentence, Mr. Buchanan implied that the Institute had used Ford Foundation money to fund the Quicksilver Times. 9, in fact, the Institute has never funded the Quicksilver Times. To the best of my knowledge and belief, the Washingtonian magazine article cited by Mr. Buchanan does not state that the Institute ever funded the Quicksilver Times. 10, the names of the Institute for Policy Studies and its co-directors, Marcus Raskin and Richard Barnett, have been mentioned in the course of hearings before the Senate Select Committee in connection with the so-called list of, quote, enemies, unquote, of the administration, against whom certain administration officials urged that the resources of various government agencies be applied. In addition, an exhibit referred to during Mr. Ehrlichman's testimony, the Krogh-Young memo to Ehrlichman of August 11, 1971, indicates that both Raskin and Barnett were, quote, overheard, end of quote. 11, the Institute has been the subject of an audit by the Internal Revenue Service ever since the Nixon administration took office. The latest audit began in January of 1970, apparently as part of the IRS, quote, Special Service Group, unquote, program. The scope and nature of the audit can hardly be described as routine. 12, at present, the Internal Revenue Service, using quite unusual procedures, has proposed to revoke the Institute's tax exemption. The grounds for revocation do not include any of the alleged activities mentioned by Mr. Buchanan, but rather concern charitable and educational activities of the Institute, which are indistinguishable from the activities of other institutions of higher learning in the United States, but which do involve viewpoints differing sharply from those of the administration. 13, it appears that the Internal Revenue Service in this case has not followed Mr. Buchanan's professed belief that educational organizations which study social issues but which do not engage in political activities should be permitted to maintain their tax exemption regardless of whether they are considered, quote, liberal, unquote, or, quote, conservative, unquote. 14, the Institute has learned from a former FBI informant that the FBI on several occasions has infiltrated the Institute for policy studies with agents and informants, and on at least one occasion joined with a member of the Metropolitan Police Department in the theft of documents from the Institute. 15, we have also been advised by a former special agent of the FBI that the FBI has improperly secured the bank records of the Institute without the use of legal process. 16, the Institute has evidence of illegal surveillance of the Institute by governmental agencies by means of wiretapping, electronic surveillance, and breaking and entering. 17, representatives of the Institute will be able to supply you with further details of these activities. Signed, Mitchell Rogovin, subscribed and sworn before me this 3rd day of October 1973, Lois M. Clements, Notary Public.
The affidavit will be received as a part of the record under Rule 6 of the committee's standing rules. The chair would indicate that since the affidavit, as in the case of all affidavits, is not subject to cross-examination, and since from the reading of it, it would appear that some information is based on other sources, if any member of the committee desires further information or pursue the matter further, of course, under the standing rules of the committee, we would pursue it in whatever manner seemed appropriate. If there's no objection, then the affidavit will be received and made part of the record. Our first witness this morning has arrived, and if he would hold up his right hand, I will administer the oath before we proceed to the matter of the immunity order. Would you please state your name?
John R. Buckley.
Mr. Buckley, do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated. Mr. Buckley, we have before us a certified copy of an order over the signature of Judge John J. Sirica, Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, filed October 9th, 1973, and bearing docket number miscellaneous 70-73, entitled In the Matter of the Application of the United States Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. This order confers use immunity on the application of this committee under the relevant sections of the United States Code, particularly Title 18, Sections 6002 and 6005. And the mandate of the order is that you, the witness, in accordance with those provisions, shall not be excused from testifying or providing other information before the committee on the ground that the testimony or other information sought may tend to incriminate you. If there is no objection on the part of the committee, the order of immunity will be incorporated in the record as a part of our official proceedings. Mr. Witness, do you understand the nature and the intent of that order?
I do.
Very well. Would counsel then proceed with the examination of the witness?
Yes, Senator Baker, Mr. Rufus Edmonston, Deputy Chief Counsel, will initially question the witness.
Mr. Buckley, for the record, please state your name and address.
John R. Buckley, 13410 Grenoble, Grenoble Drive, Rockville, Maryland.
You are represented by counsel. Would the counsel identify himself, please?
My name is Kenneth D. Wood, and I'm a member of the District of Columbia Bar.
Mr. Buckley, what's your present employment status?
I'm retired.
When did you first begin government service?
I had government service in the Navy during World War II.
And what did you first work for in the federal government? What agency?
In the FBI.
And when did you retire?
In this year, June 30.
And then you were employed where?
After I retired,
After retirement from the FBI.
I have no employment at the present time. I have...
No, after you retired from the FBI.
I resigned from the FBI in 1964.
And then you were employed where?
For a period of about a year, I was self-employed in the District of Columbia.
And then you were employed where after that?
After that, I was employed by the House Education and Labor Committee, House of Representatives.
In what capacity there? What were your functions, your duties?
I was chief investigator for the minority of that committee and had duties as counsel on poverty matters.
Now, when you left the House Committee in 1969, Mr. Buckley, where were you employed then?
I then went to the Office of Economic Opportunity as the director of the Inspection Division.
How did you obtain your job there?
It was an appointment by the director, then Donald Rumsfeld.
Had he known you before?
He had known me by virtue of 2 or 3 contacts in the House of Representatives.
Now, what were your duties at OEO?
I supervised a squad of 30 to 50 inspectors and supporting staff in inspections and investigations of irregularities and noncompliance of OEO guidelines in grantee and contract programs.
That involved a good deal of investigative work, and I'm sure that you drew upon your former work as an investigator there.
Yes,
Is that
sir.
correct?
That's correct.
Now, that was certainly could be called a full-time job, couldn't it, Mr. Buckley?
Yes, sir.
When did you leave the OEO?
June 30, 1973.
What was your reason for leaving?
I was retired.
Now, Mr. Buckley, during the years between your retirement from the FBI and your employment with the OEO, I think the record shows, your interview shows at least, that you worked for several political campaigns. One of them, I believe, was Mr. Cecil Underwood's campaign in 1964 for the governor of West Virginia. What did you do in that campaign?
I was involved in investigating situations in West Virginia for the Republican candidate for governor.
I think we noted that you also worked for a gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina, Mr. Jim Gardner. What did you do for Mr. Gardner?
In 1968, on 2 separate and very brief occasions, I investigated allegations that Mr. Gardner was concerned about.
Did Mr. Gardner ask you to go to North Carolina?
Yes, sir.
Were you employed at that time with the House Committee?
I was.
I take it this was on your own time.
It was. It involved 2 weekends with probably a Friday or a Monday connected with each.
What did you investigate in North Carolina?
I investigated, number one, and documented a situation in a state institution for juveniles involving a rape of one of the inmates by one of the counselors in the institution.
What did you do? Another investigation?
Subsequently, after the election, we examined voting registrations and voting in the Durham, North Carolina area.
Now, Mr. Buckley, during the course of your employment with the House Committee, did you meet a man named Ken Reitz?
Yes, sir, I did.
What was your association with Mr. Reitz at that time?
I first met Ken Reitz in probably January of 1967, and he at that time was an aide to a congressman who was on the Education and Labor Committee and had an office directly near mine.
What was the basis of your continued relationship with Mr. Reitz during the House? Did you see him often? Were you well acquainted with him? Was he a friend or what?
In connection with committee business, would have occasion to see Mr. Reitz and his congressman several times during the session in consideration of manpower and poverty bills under the jurisdiction of the House Education and Labor Committee.
Now, did you receive a call from Mr. Ken Reitz in late July or early August of 1971?
Yes, sir.
Why did he call you?
He called me to extend an invitation to go to lunch.
All right, you did go to lunch.
Yes, we did.
You had a discussion with him. What did he ask of you or tell you at that luncheon?
He indicated at that time that he was in charge of youth activity, the youth vote, for the committee to re-elect the president. And in addition to that, he had a responsibility to determine, as far as he could, what the activities, what the location and general activities of the Muskie campaign headquarters, Senator Muskie's campaign headquarters.
All right, now, Mr. Buckley, you just mentioned that Mr. Reitz had known you in the House. Why you, of all people, would Mr. Reitz call you and ask you to help formulate a plan, knowing fully well that you were employed at the OEO? What basis did he have to call you and ask for your assistance?
I can't speak for Mr. Reitz, but I would assume that he was familiar with my background as an investigator and that we had at one time or another a discussion of political campaigns or political investigations.
Well, now, you said that Mr. Reitz asked you to come up with some proposals or a plan. Did you come up with a plan?
He asked me if I would help him ascertain where the Muskie headquarters were, who the volunteers, what the staff was, or who comprised the staff, and generally what the candidate's itinerary would be in the ensuing months.
All right, did you formulate a plan to help him do that?
Not at that time. I suggested that there were many standard ways that one gets a volunteer into an opponent's campaign, and suggested that a clerk or a stenographer or a member of the press or one posing as a member of the press would very easily ascertain the things that he was interested in, most of which I consider to be public information.
But did Mr. Reitz think those proposals were good plans about planting a press person, a campaign aide?
I don't believe at that point that anything specific was suggested. He indicated that something of that nature might be satisfactory.
All right, now, did you finally come up with a definite plan
Yes.
for Mr. Reitz?
Yes, I did.
All right, now, what was that plan?
Subsequent to that meeting, there appeared in a local newspaper a column indicating that Senator Humphreys had two taxi cab rides on a particular day, and neither of the cab drivers would accept a fare from it. And that appears, if I may, in the September 27 issue of the Washington Star.
1971. Written by Mr. Morris Siegel.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, the witnesses identified the article. Could we have it included in the record?
Without objection, the article will be received as in evidence as an exhibit and appropriately numbered as such.
I'll read this article. It says, on the other hand, Hubert H. Humphrey, who incidentally didn't make it working with Bob Short either, apparently doesn't miss anything that went with being number two except his chauffeur-driven car, if he misses that. He cabbed it over to a luncheon with editors the other day, and once the hack driver discovered who his distinguished passenger was, he wouldn't accept any money for the fare. Quote, no way, Senator, I'm going to take any money from you. You ought to be president, end quote, he said proudly when Humphrey offered him money. On the return trip to Capitol Hill, Humphrey got into another cab, and it was the same story all over again. Now, if somebody will come along and offer Humphrey an airplane ride in a reasonable facsimile of Air Force One, he might not even miss being president. Is that what prompted you to come up with your plan?
That suggested something to me.
All right. Now, Did Mr. Reitz approve of that plan?
Well, I hadn't drawn the plan for him at that time. I had been acquainted for years with a semi-retired cab driver who was interested in some kind of employment that would get him a weekly wage, and I discussed with him the possibility of his volunteering in the campaign committee of Senator Muskie, and he suggested that he would, and Reitz approved the plan.
All right, who was this cab driver? Identify him, please. What was his name?
Can I speak with counsel, please? Mr. Chairman, we've identified the name of this cab driver on at least 2 or 3 occasions to members of your staff. Would the committee consider withholding his name from public identification at this point?
It's rather general knowledge, Mr. Chairman. I think it's been printed several papers.
Well, I'm not, I think the committee would be disinclined to suppress any truth at all in this investigation, even if the truth might prove embarrassing to somebody.
I mention that because this man is at an advanced age. He has been ill, and that is the reason that I requested it.
Well, I sympathize with him, but I don't know any reason why the committee should suppress truth.
Would you identify the cab driver's name, Mr. Buckley?
His name is Elmer Wyatt.
How did you become acquainted with Mr. Elmer Wyatt?
I had known him for a prior 5 or 6 years, having seen him on some occasions, having used his cab on other occasions for transportation in the district.
Well, was Mr. Wyatt anxious to help you carry out your plan?
He was willing.
Had you ever done any investigative work using Mr. Wyatt before, Mr. Buckley?
I hadn't done any investigative work using him as an aid. No, I had not.
All right, you contacted Mr. Wyatt, and you told him of the plan, and you had approval from Mr. Ken Reitz.
Yes, I did.
Now, what were the terms agreed upon, the amount of payment? What did you tell Mr. Wyatt you would pay him?
If I may, at the initial meeting with Reitz, we discussed if a full-time volunteer was to be utilized for the purposes of reporting back to us, that we would certainly expect to pay them a weekly salary. And I estimated that to get any of the people that occurred to me on the first meeting, it would take between $150 and $200 a week. And at that time, he wondered if $1,000 a month would cover the whole thing, and I expressed my thought that it would.
All right, so you were given assurances by Mr. Ken Reitz of the committee to re-elect the president that you would get $1,000 a month to take care of the program.
Yes, providing it was successful and providing it could be continued or was feasible.
All right, now how did Mr. Wyatt work himself into the Muskie organization? Did he just walk in the door or what?
He walked to the Muskie campaign headquarters with the newspaper article and suggested to the person in charge of volunteers there that if cab drivers could do it for Senator Humphrey, that he would be willing to spend some time each day running errands for the Muskie campaign people.
Was he successful? Was he accepted as a volunteer for the organization?
He was.
All right. Now, shortly after he began work for the Muskie organization, what was he doing? What job did he get?
He did a number of things, from what he told me. He took clothes to the cleaners, and he took packages to the stationery store and things of that nature. But one assignment that was to become more or less regularly his was to carry messages from the Muskie campaign headquarters to the senator's office on Capitol Hill.
All right, so he would gather up, you say messages. I suppose that includes documents, letters, press releases, things of that nature, and place them in some container and carry them from Muskie's headquarters here to the Senate.
That's generally accurate.
All right, now, did you make an arrangement with him that he would call you after receiving the Muskie documents down there and let you look at them?
This, of course, took several weeks, probably 2 or 3 weeks to begin this. And an arrangement was made whereby he would call me when he was leaving the campaign headquarters and tell me that he was en route with a box of memoranda. Now, this would require several things. It would require, number one, that he went in that day. It would require that there wasn't someone accompanying him, as frequently happened, that it not be raining, because the papers then would be wet, and that I be available. I frequently was not available when he called, and other times would be involved in agency business and could not meet him.
All right, so Mr. Wyatt would call you when you were available, and would he tell you to meet him somewhere?
Meet him on a corner.
What would you do?
Nearby corner. I would proceed to meet him at 19th and L or 20th and M.
And then you proceeded to do what?
Then we would drive for a couple of blocks, and I proceeded to look at the memoranda that was in the box.
All right, after you looked at the memoranda and you determined that you might want some of it, what did you do then?
I tried unsuccessfully for 1 or 2 of these meetings to photograph itineraries and memoranda that were in the box. It was not a successful effort. The light was inappropriate. My equipment was not suitable.
Well, where were you attempting to do this photographing? In the car?
In the back seat of the taxi.
Well, that was rather awkward, wasn't it?
I don't understand. Awkward in what way?
Awkward to get the job done.
It certainly wasn't suitable. It didn't get the job done.
Now, Mr. Buckley, at any time did you have to open any envelopes to procure the documents you wanted?
No, sir. One of the rules that we had from the time we started, and one of the rules that I made clear to Reitz and the taxi cab driver, was that at no time would any mail or any envelopes be delayed or be handled or be tampered with in any fashion, and they weren't.
Now, you just described having difficulty making photographs of materials in the back of the car and at different places. What did you do to try to improve your operation?
Subsequently, I rented an office which was located near the Muskie Campaign Committee, and at about the same time I purchased some new equipment and some lights which would be more effective in document copying.
Where was this office?
It was at 1026 17th Street Northwest.
And I suppose you rented that from...
I rented that from the managing company that was on the ground floor.
Did they ask you what you wanted it for?
No, I rented it in my own name as an attorney.
Right. Now, we have some equipment over here, if we could have it shown to you. If you could describe to the committee how your operation went, it'd be helpful.
Sure.
Did you purchase this equipment, Mr. Buckley, from a commercial
Yes, I did.
Camera shop? Which camera shop?
I purchased it at the Penn Camera Shop on 10th Street, I believe, 10th or 11th.
Do you have a copy of an invoice dated 10/22/1971?
We do.
Do you agree that this is a copy describing that equipment?
I agree that it is.
Mr. Chairman, could we have this inserted in the record since the witness has identified it?
If there's no objection, the document will be received in evidence as an exhibit and appropriately marked as such.
What's the total price, by the way, of the equipment you purchased at Penn Central?
$413.70.
Does that include all the equipment there?
That's on the sheet? No, there's a couple of pieces that aren't on here. This is not on here. This is an enlarger, and this is a developing tank. This is not on the list. The list includes the stand and the camera and some film.
All right, now, where did you get the money to purchase that equipment?
I used the money that was given to me by REITs on a monthly basis to purchase this.
All right, describe your operation for us. Mr. Watt would bring in the material, and you would rush up to the room, I take it.
He would bring in the material in a box that looked to me like it was an empty stationary box. The material was open in this fashion and was stacked in the box, thrown into the box like this. The stationary box might include press releases, itinerary, internal memoranda, or perhaps drafts for speeches, maybe, or position drafts.
All right, well, I suppose at times that there were letters typed up for Senator Muskie's signature which were not enclosed in an envelope, and you thereby could make photographs of that particular letter.
There could have been. I would have thought that they were in draft form too. There were no letters that were signed or stamped or any of that nature.
Did you run across a list of contributors at times?
No, I don't recall that I did.
Did you ever run across a list of people who visited the Muskie headquarters?
No, sir.
All right, after you would receive the box of material, and you would go through it and determine what was relevant for your purposes, how did you use that machine?
There would be times when there was nothing relevant in the box and we wouldn't take any pictures. This is a camera, of course. This is a copy stand. These lights light up the base of it. A document in this fashion would be photographed thus.
All right, after taking the film, would you develop it yourself?
Yes, I would.
Where?
I would develop it at home.
All right. Now, once the film was developed, what did you do with it?
Once the film was developed, I would deliver it to Ken Reitz and subsequently to another individual.
All right. Now, how did you arrange to meet Mr. Reitz, and where did you meet him?
I would call Reitz every 9 or 10 days when I had a roll of film or 2 rolls of film, and I would tell him that I had some film for him and would deliver it to him at a corner near the committee to re-elect the president.
Do you recall what that corner was?
It was different corners. It was 17th of Pennsylvania, 18th of Pennsylvania.
Now, in turn, did Mr. Reitz turn over money to you for your services when you would deliver the film to him?
Once a month.
All right. Now, did he ever discuss with you what he was going to do with that film?
No, sir, he did not.
Do you have any idea what he was doing with it?
I do not. He mentioned on one occasion early that there was someone assigned to analyze the material, and I do not know who that someone was.
All right. Finally, did Mr. Reitz start appearing late and seem somewhat uninterested in your material?
Almost from the first. He was late. There were occasions he did not come, to the point that I discussed it with him and told him that if he couldn't be punctual, that I wasn't going to continue with it.
All right, you gave him an ultimatum that if he didn't show up, you were going to have to get somebody else, right?
Just about.
All right, then who did show up?
He indicated shortly after that there would be someone else that would be contacting me, that the someone else was a man by the name of Ed Warren, and at the first meeting he would meet me in front of the Roger Smith Hotel at 18th and Pennsylvania Avenue.
All right, did you meet with Mr. Ed Warren?
I did.
Did you have any idea who he was?
I didn't at the time. I subsequently recognized after the Watergate arrests and pictures of Howard Hunt were in the paper that he was the individual that I had been meeting with during months in 1972.
All right, how many times do you figure you met with Mr. Ed Warren?
I would estimate twice or three times a month for about 4 months.
All right, now, how did you identify yourself to Mr. Ed Warren?
I identified myself to him under an assumed name. I used the name Jack Kent.
Jack Kent?
K-E-N-T.
Mr. Hunt was on the witness stand the other day, and he referred to you as Fat Jack. How did that come about?
I have no idea. I never heard that name until a month or 6 weeks ago when Reitz, in a conversation, told me that they referred to me, they meaning Hunt, I suppose, and others, as Fat Jack. That's the first time I've heard it.
So your assumed name was Jack Kent?
That's right.
And why'd you pick that name?
I can only guess that Kent Cigarettes suggested it to me. I had no reason to select it.
Describe your meetings with Mr. Warren. Did you talk a good deal with him, or what transpired? Did you just take him to film and walk away, or what?
No, they were very formal or very short. I don't think he trusted me completely, and I didn't trust him. It was merely a matter of delivering the envelope and saying good day. No coffee, no conversations of any length at all.
Well, it might be described then as a meeting of two spies who didn't really trust one another.
I expect so.
Rufus, could we move that material? I mean, it's impressive equipment, I'm sure, but I can't see the witness. And if we could...
Yeah.
It's a camera equipment. This is a developer, and this is an enlarger.
Now, after Mr. Buckley, you had met with Mr. Ken Reitz for a while. You met with Mr. Warren for a while. When did the project finally terminate, and what caused it to terminate?
The project terminated when Senator Muskie announced his withdrawal from the race, the nomination. And to the best of my recollection, it was in April of 1972, and it had, for previous weeks, sort of dwindled. Our activity and his interest decreased as the position of Senator Muskie became worse, or it became more apparent that he would not be a successful nominee.
Well, how were you notified that you were to cease your operations?
We had discussed it as the primaries developed and indicated that we would terminate if Senator Muskie withdrew.
After Senator Muskie fell in the polls, were you asked to infiltrate the McGovern campaign in the same manner?
No, sir, I was not.
All right. Thereafter, Mr. Buckley, did you perform any other services for the committee to re-elect the president?
No, sir.
Have you since that time?
I don't think so.
All right. What did Mr. Wyatt do following his termination, the cab driver?
He was not active in that any longer. I assume that he resumed his taxi business.
Have you talked to him since that time?
Yes, I have.
Do you know that Mr. Wyatt had an interview with the staff of the committee?
I knew that I became aware that the staff of the committee interviewed him early this summer. I did not become aware of it until after he had been interviewed, and he did call me that night and told me that he had been subpoenaed and that he had talked to staff members and that he denied any involvement in any of this activity.
Did he tell you, though, later that he did come back and substantiate everything you said?
He told me before he came back later that he was asked to come back.
Now, Mr. Buckley, when you were working at the OAO, you had a rather high position down there. Did anyone at the OAO know of any of your activities at any time regarding this?
I don't think so. I'm quite sure they did not.
Did they discover after the activity had occurred and was maybe brought to their attention?
I don't think so. Probably in light of the recent publicity.
But you don't think that you said that you retired yourself, so this activity had nothing to do with your leaving OAO?
No, sir.
How is it possible for you to be absent on those occasions from your office without some word of explanation?
The meetings involved, at the most about 35 or 40 minutes. We had a rule that we would not be together more than 15 minutes. The location was about 6 or 7 minutes from my office building, and it coincided with the lunch hour. It happened usually and most always between 11 and 12 o'clock.
All right. Now, the calls that you had received from Mr. Wyatt and from Mr. Reitz, did they cause anybody any concern at your office?
I have never heard anyone express concern.
Now,
the Reitz calls would be very infrequent. The Wyatt calls would happen, I'm sure, a couple times a week.
now I believe in your interview with the staff, Mr. Buckley, you have testified that you were given around $8,000 for this operation.
I base that on my recollection that we were involved about 7 or 8 months. If it was 7 months, it would be $7,000. If it was 8 months, it would be $8,000.
Well, why don't you break that down for the committee? What happened to that money?
The money substantially went to the cab driver. He received what money wasn't spent on equipment and film and expenses of that kind. In the early weeks, in light of the equipment purchases, he was given $150 a week. And yeah, well. And when the equipment had been purchased, he was then given $175 a week, and the rental of the office space was $100 a month.
All right, so you were testifying that you didn't benefit one iota from any of this
No, sir,
activity.
Not any money to me. It's my recollection that there were times when I spent some of my money in the operation.
Now, Mr. Buckley, let's go back to these boxes that you received from Mr. Elmer Wyatt. I know that it's hard to reconstruct details when you see lots of materials, but try to remember some of the documents you saw. You saw press releases. You saw itineraries.
Yes.
You saw drafts of letters. Well, they could have been letters, couldn't they?
They weren't signed. They weren't stamped.
Well, it could have been a letter prepared waiting for Senator Muskie's signature.
It's possible. My recollection is that they were rough draft letters.
Did you see letters from contributors? Did you see letters coming to Senator Muskie from contributors?
No, I did not. And my recollection is I did not.
Did you see drafts of speeches?
They were drafts, and very conceivably could be speeches or releases or position papers.
Well, you read them, didn't you? That was your purpose.
I glanced through them. I did not evaluate or analyze them.
Well, how did you know what you were giving them if you didn't read this material?
I did say I glanced through them. If it pertained to an itinerary of the candidates, or if it pertained to a press release on a particular topic If it pertained to his position on an issue, what could be considered an issue, it was relevant. It was something that I would be interested in. If it did not, I did not photograph it.
So that was your criteria?
Essentially.
In other words, you had to read every document that was in the box to determine which ones you were going to choose.
I wouldn't be argumentative with you. I did not read it all. It wouldn't take only a glance to determine that some of the material would not fit into that category, in any of those categories.
How did you?
I didn't have time to read a lengthy document. If it had a caption and it started out dealing with his itinerary, it was something I was interested in. I wouldn't have to read it all.
Have you come upon any evidence that any of your material ever appeared in any newspapers, the material you collected?
The only situation that I can respond to that is that it's been publicized that a Senator Muskie memo was forwarded to Evans and Novak and later put in their column. I do not recall seeing that memo, but I do recall one instance in late '71 that the cab driver indicated to me that the people at the Muskie campaign headquarters were very much concerned and excited that an internal memo had been published in the paper. I feel that that probably was the memo, but I don't recall photographing it. I conveyed my concern then to Reitz, indicating that it was not our purpose to be furnishing any internal memoranda of Senator Muskie to the newspapers or anybody else, and if they were doing that with it, that we would discontinue also. I felt that was an intelligence gathering operation.
Well, now, do you ever recall looking at any kind of a paper prepared by Senator Muskie relating to the nomination of Mr. William Rehnquist?
Yes, sir. I recall that draft, and it was a draft. It was double-spaced. I photographed it.
Now, Mr. Buckley, you're a very experienced man. You've worked for the government for a long time. I'm sure that you're very familiar with the Hatch Act. Are you not?
I'm somewhat familiar with it.
Did you read the Hatch Act before engaging in this activity?
I have read the Hatch Act, and I read it about that time. It was my feeling that the Hatch Act, which spells out activities which are prohibited and spells out activities that are permitted, was silent in this area, and I didn't feel that the Hatch Act applied.
Well, do you know that the Hatch Act reads that it shall be unlawful for any person employed in any administrative position by the United States or by any department, independent agency, or other agents of the United States, and I will leave out including a corporation, to use his official authority for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the election or nomination of any candidate for the office of President, Vice President, and Presidential Elector. And I emphasize the word affecting.
Affected or interfered with? Well, whatever interpretation is placed on that, I didn't feel that it applied to me. I couldn't see that I was interfering with the election or the nomination of Senator Muskie.
If you have to look back over your activities, Mr. Buckley, do you think that your activities were a waste of time? Did it do any good?
I didn't hear the last of your question.
Did your activities reap any benefits for the purpose for which you began your activities, that is, to affect the campaign of Muskie?
Not as far as I'm concerned, in light of Senator Muskie's not getting the nomination. Had he been successful in getting the nomination, I wouldn't have felt the time was wasted.
Well, what was your original purpose for engaging in that activity? Was it to affect the campaign of Senator Muskie?
Was it to affect his campaign?
Yes.
I didn't feel that. My purpose was to gather for Reitz and whoever else was interested information concerning Senator Muskie's itinerary, what his position was on issues of the day, and that type of thing.
Well, have you heard any word about whether or not you were in some way helpful to the committee to re-elect the president?
No, I haven't.
Do you think it was?
Successful in the 1972 elections?
Well,
I don't feel that it was helpful to the election of the Republican candidate.
well, I just sit here and sort of wonder why you took the job.
Why I took the job?
Yes.
It never occurred to me not to.
Well, would you do it again?
I wouldn't do it for a while, I don't think.
I'm going to have to ask the audience to refrain from demonstrating in any way their reaction to anything which occurs in the hearing room. And I solicit their cooperation in this request.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have one final question. Did you think you were helping the committee to re-elect the president?
I suppose I did. I felt that I was furnishing a service to them that they needed, otherwise they wouldn't have asked me to. It didn't seem possible that they didn't know where Senator Muskie's headquarters was, because I found that out, I think, in 60 seconds. But that was their request.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Buckley, did you have contact with anyone else at the committee to re-elect, except Mr. Reese, concerning your hiring of the cab driver?
Reitz and Howard Hunt.
Did you ever discuss the matter with Bart Porter?
No, sir, I do not know that man.
Did you ever discuss the matter with Jeb Magruder?
No, sir.
When Mr. Reitz first talked to you, I believe you indicated that he said that he had been given an assignment. Did he say who had given him that assignment?
No, he did not. He indicated that it was an additional responsibility of his.
Did he ever tell you who was furnishing the money for the assignment?
No, sir.
Did you have any independent knowledge as to who was furnishing the money for the assignment?
I did not.
You've indicated some of the types of material that you viewed and photographed. Was any of this type material that was public material that someone could go to the headquarters and obtain?
The press releases and the itineraries were. The itineraries frequently were published in press release form.
Well, why was it necessary to go through these gyrations then to obtain it? Were you getting it earlier than you otherwise could have gotten it?
I think so. Some of the press releases might be a day earlier.
The internal documents, I assume, would not have been public knowledge at any time.
I wouldn't think so.
What I'm interested in is what type, how you analyzed it yourself, having worked in political campaigns, what type material would a campaign organization turn over to some person who just walks in off the street and says that they want to help, as evidently this cab driver did? Were you surprised at the confidentiality of any of the documents that you saw, or were they things that were highly confidential?
At some of it, they weren't classified, of course, but a memo like the a critical memo of concerning the Rehnquist prospective appointment, I thought was a sensitive document, and was surprised to see it there. Much of the material was not.
Did Mr. Wyatt ever indicate that he had any trouble obtaining any of these documents?
No, my impression is that the box was given to him when he came in the morning, and he merely carried it from there to the Hill.
How long did he work there before he was entrusted with this type document?
Not long, a matter of 2 or 3 weeks.
And who in the organization, not a name in particular, but who in the organization turned these documents over to them? What position did that person hold?
I don't know. I don't know the names of, I can't recall any of the names of the Muskie campaign people.
You said you discussed with Mr. Reed some alternative methods of obtaining the information that you wanted to obtain. What other alternative methods did you discuss, if you recall?
They were generally in the nature of infiltration or penetration. They are methods that I consider standard, that I think most people in political contests know. It involves volunteers as clerks, volunteers as stenographers, volunteer press people, volunteer students, anyone that would ingratiate themselves with the opposition and gain access to some.
So they all encompass the idea of in effect, supplying a volunteer to Muskie headquarters.
Did I suggest any others? I'm sorry, I didn't.
I say all the ideas that you discussed encompass the idea of supplying some type of volunteer to headquarters.
In the Muskie headquarters or in the Muskie campaign, road activity or out-of-town speeches, that kind of thing.
You mentioned previously in connection with that, when Mr. Edmiston was questioning you, that some of this information would have been public knowledge. Did you discuss the possibility of just having someone assimilate what would be public knowledge as far as Mr. Muskie's position on issues were concerned, or anything like that, or were you concerned about getting them before anybody else would get them?
I think the reason that I got them, I didn't examine it that closely. I felt that they weren't getting it anyplace else, that they had that the Committee to Re-elect the President had no access to that material as in the past.
Right, now you mentioned what you considered to be traditional campaign activity, and I'm sure that will want to be further pursued, but I won't take any more time at this point. So I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
In a moment, Senator Talmadge will ask Mr. Buckley how he first came across Elmer Wyatt, the spy he placed in the Muskie office. Right now, we're going to take a short break. Public television coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of the hearings is being broadcast as a public service by your local public television station. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, NPACT correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As we go back to the hearings, it is Senator Talmadge's turn to question John Buckley.
Senator Talmadge.
Mr. Buckley, when and where did you first meet Mr. Elmer Wyatt?
Senator, I met him in the early 60s in Washington, D.C. At the time, he was driving a taxi cab, and at the time, I was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Was there anything peculiar about the first time you met him?
Senator, my recollection is, and I haven't verified this with Mr. Wyatt, that he was one of several people that we interviewed in connection with some arrests made in a gambling establishment.
Was he playing cards in the gambling establishment?
My recollection is that he was there. I'm not sure what he did. We did interview him and others that were there as witnesses, and they were released. There wasn't any.
After that, you got to be good friends, I take it.
Over a period of years, I saw him occasionally.
Now, when you employed him to infiltrate the Muskie headquarters, what criteria were you looking for?
As far as a person to infiltrate,
Yes.
in view of the Siegel article, a cab driver that was available and that would be willing to take that kind of an assignment.
Did you think a man that you had caught in a gambling bust would be ideal for that sort of duty?
Senator, he was the only one I knew that was available for this.
Where did you keep the money that you used to finance Mr. White and his operation?
I kept it in cash. I kept it in the office, in my desk, or in a safe. I kept it at home at different times and used it as I had to.
During all that period, you were a full-time federal employee
Yes, sir.
under the Hatch Act.
Yes, sir.
I believe you stated that you did not think your duties was a violation of the Hatch Act.
I did not feel they were.
Did you think theft was permitted by the Hatch Act?
Theft, sir?
Yes.
I didn't give it any thought.
You didn't know that that was specifically, you thought that was permitted by the Hatch Act?
I had no reason to consider theft in these circumstances.
Don't you think taking someone else's personal documents and photographing them and delivering them elsewhere is theft?
No, sir, I don't.
What do you think it is?
I'm not sure what it is.
You
I
don't,
don't
think it's
a theft.
singing in a choir, do you?
I don't know how to respond to that, Senator.
Well, you wouldn't think it's one of the highest virtues of mankind, would you? I'll put it that way.
Senator, I think it's political espionage. I think it's infiltration. I think it's penetration. I think it's something that occurs in every major election that happens in this country.
You think it's perfectly legitimate?
I think it's valid.
You don't feel contrite about your part in it, whatever?
No, sir, I do not.
Well, why'd you take the Fifth Amendment then and ask for immunity before you testify?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the full range of law in the new election laws and statutes, and for that reason, I thought that there may be something in those new laws that verged on this kind of activity.
Your operation was strictly cash. You received the money in cash and paid it out in cash, did you?
Yes, sir.
With no records retained?
Didn't keep any records.
How many times did you deliver photographs of documents that you took from Senator Muskie to Mr. Wright or the committee to re-elect the president?
My estimation would be twice a month to each, and if it went 7 months, approximately 15 times, and if it went 8 months, maybe 2 or 3 more times.
Did you think the operation was larger than you first envisioned that it would be?
Larger, sir?
Yes, sir.
No, I didn't think it was larger.
Did you think it's more productive?
I was surprised that at the early development of this kind of material being available to this man, I didn't envision that such a thing would happen as quickly as it did, or that it would happen at all.
Did you get more secret information than you thought you would?
I didn't see any classified information in that material, Senator.
Confidential?
Confidential. I saw sensitive material. I don't think any of it was classified.
You did find some sensitive material then?
I would think that the Rehnquist draft was a sensitive piece of paper.
You weren't paid for your activities, were you?
No, sir.
You thought you were serving the cause of re-electing the president, I presume?
I would answer yes. I wouldn't put it that way. I thought that I was providing a service that I was asked to do. I certainly had a preference of candidates and would have preferred that a Republican president be reelected.
You thought you were serving friends then?
Part of it.
Now, in your operations with Mr. Warren, did they differ any from your previous operations when you delivered the documents to Mr. Rentz?
He was more punctual, he was on time, and it caused me a lot less concern than my relationship with Reitz over the previous 3 months or 4 months.
You also, I believe, delivered some actual documents to Mr. Warren in lieu of photographs, did you not?
Not documents, Senator. There were occasions when the taxicab driver would bring a press release from the press table, and that would be delivered in its form. There were perhaps 2 occasions when I enlarged and printed the material for Hunt.
Did Mr. Rentz ever tell you that information which you'd received from the Muskie camp had been leaked to the press?
On the contrary, he told me that memo hadn't come from the committee to re-elect. he told me at that time, when I confronted him with it, a year later or so, he told me that he had lied to me and that, in fact, that memo had come from the committee to reelect two Evans and Novak.
Did any information which you received from the Muskie headquarters and delivered to Mr. Rentz get leaked to the press, news media?
I'm not aware of any beyond the Evans and Novak.
I thought he did inform you that some of it was leaked to Evans and Novak.
That one particular memo, he told me long after the campaign that the committee had sent that to Evans and Novak.
What was the total amount of funds that you received for the operation?
Senator, my recollection is that that we went about 7 months, and if it was 7 months, it's $7,000, and if it was 8 months, it's $8,000. I'm thinking of the period from September 1971 to April 1972.
And that covered Mr. White's salary, the office rent, photographic material, and et cetera?
Yes, sir.
Now, following the break-in, when it was in the newspapers, you recognized that the alias that you'd been dealing with, Mr. Warren, was in fact Howard Hunt. Did you become concerned about that?
Following the break-in, the name Edward Warren appeared in connection with payment of some rooms in the Watergate Hotel or in the Howard Johnson, and I don't know whether I was concerned, but it occurred to me that this was the same guy that I'd been meeting.
Did you discuss it with the committee to re-elect the president?
I don't think I did. There wasn't anyone that I was acquainted with to discuss it with. I certainly did in the next year discuss it 2 or 3 times with Reitz.
You did discuss it
Yes,
with Mr. Reitz. Did he advise you to go to the authorities and tell them about it?
No, he did not.
Did you give any thought to going to the authorities and telling them about it?
No, sir.
You gave no thought to informing the FBI?
No, sir.
Why not?
Of informing the FBI about what activities that I had been involved in?
Activities that you had performed in your association with Mr. Howard Hunt.
Senator, I didn't see any connection between what activity I had been involved in that terminated 3 or 4 months before the Watergate arrests and the rubber gloves and the burglar tools that were used in the Watergate.
Well, you were meeting him on the street in a clandestine manner, and both of you were using aliases and transferring documents and cash money. Didn't you think there might be something a little mysterious about it?
I think that goes on in Washington, Senator.
You didn't think it was a normal transaction like going in a restaurant and buying breakfast, did you?
I thought it was a normal transaction for election year.
You thought appearing on corners, both parties using aliases, transferring stolen documents and photographs was a normal transaction in an election year?
I don't know about stolen documents. I think that would be called discreet. That's the way that I attempted to keep it.
Where did you learn ethics in political campaigns, Mr. Buckley?
I suppose I learned it from a period 1964 to 1973.
Was that in some political machine in some big city, or how did you learn it in that fashion?
I learned much of it in West Virginia.
Now, did you ever discuss your involvement in the Muskie intelligence operation with your superior, Mr. Jerris Leonard?
Senator, Jerris Leonard is a member of a law firm in the city. I have had discussions with Mr. Leonard, and I would stand on the lawyer-client privileged communications with him in regard to the activity that we've been discussing today.
Did anyone ever instruct you to remain silent on your part in the matter?
No, sir.
You did not.
No, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Garney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Buckley, what did you expect to find in this activity? What really useful information?
Senator, when it started, I didn't know what to find. I didn't know but what he would be rejected, meaning the cab driver. I certainly thought that it would be not much of a chore to find out where the senator was going to be in days, for weeks at a time, what the position of the senator would be on controversies and issues. A staff list of his volunteers was made available to the taxicab driver within a matter of days. They all were furnished a staff list with the telephone numbers of all the volunteers.
Are you saying that what you were looking for was really general intelligence as to what Senator Muskie was doing in his campaign and things he was saying or intended to say?
Yes, sir. It didn't occur to me that would be difficult to find out at all.
As I understand the Hatch Act, I don't have it before me here, but it's unlawful in your official capacity if you're a government employee to interfere with an election or influence an election. And I understand you had a job with the OEO, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And what was the job?
I was Director of Investigations, Director of Inspections.
Did you in any way in this Muskie operation use your official position?
No, sir. That was one of 5 or 6 rules that I had with REITs, that there would be no government facilities or material used, that it would be done on my own time, that nothing illegal would be involved, and that I would be the judge of what activities and what responsibilities the cab driver was to have.
And this is why you think that you did not violate the Hatch Act.
That is one reason that I do not think so. The Hatch Act, as I read it, deals with and anticipates collecting of funds for political activity, passing out literature, running for office, taking part in partisan conventions or meetings, that kind of thing, and it's fairly well spelled out in the Act.
Both the chief counsel, or counsel who's doing the question for the majority, and Senator Talmadge touched upon prior activities in West Virginia and North Carolina, as I understand. Did these involve dirty tricks, or what did they involve anyway? Will you explain?
Senator, for the most part in West Virginia, I was occupied for 4.5 months in investigating irregularities on the part of the preceding governor of the state of West Virginia.
And did
Sir?
Who was that?
That was Governor Barron, Governor Wally Barron of West Virginia.
And what did you find out?
I maintained a running account of the activity that we were involved in there. We found out that $1.5 million of federal flood relief money was completely dissipated. We found out that there were kickbacks involved in dummy corporations purportedly designed to do this cleanup after the flood. And all of this material was published and was publicized in the state of West Virginia. Subsequent to '64, that governor and many of his top aides have been indicted and convicted for misuse of federal funds.
Was this governor a Republican governor?
He was a Democratic governor.
And you turned your information over to the proper authorities?
We turned it over to the candidate who made it available to the proper authorities, the FBI. And
this resulted in indictments and convictions?
Yes, sir.
Ultimately. So you weren't doing dirty tricks, you were investigating?
Investigating all of the time. The dirty tricks,
were any Republicans involved in this illegal activity that resulted in convictions?
No, sir.
Well, now, what were you doing in North Carolina? Were those dirty tricks?
No, sir. I mentioned on 2 occasions, at the request of the government, at the request of the Republican candidate, I went to look into a situation of rape in a state institution that was never reported. There was never any.
What did that have to do with the campaign?
At that particular time, it amounted to what would appear to be negligence and a cover-up by the state authorities of this situation.
Go on. Go on.
In the second instance, it involved a review of registrations and voting in the 1968 election in the Durham area.
And what did you find out there?
It was based on allegations, and we did find some instances where Democratic registrants were registered from vacant lots, and other instances where people who had been dead had voted in that campaign.
What about Republicans? Were they involved? Did you find irregularities there?
I didn't review the Republican registrations.
This was the extent of your activity. It did not involve dirty tricks, then?
No,
It
sir.
was purely investigating into election irregularities?
Yes, sir.
Now, what did you find out in... How many documents did you photograph in this Muskie operation? Do you recall?
I do not recall how many or what volume. There would be times when we wouldn't photograph any. There would be times when there'd be 3 or 4. And there might be a time, as in case of the draft that I'm talking to, while it was one document, it might have run 10 or 11 pages.
Can you describe these documents in any more detail? You mentioned 1 or 2. What about some of the others?
No more detail than a memo from a staffer to another staffer, or a memo from a staffer to the senator, or a double-spaced draft of a paper on, and I'm not sure there was one, on the unemployment rate.
Now, these were documents that were being carried from his campaign headquarters to his Senate headquarters. Is
Yes,
that correct?
Yes.
Were these going to the senator to keep him informed about what was going on? Is that the idea, or what?
Possibly, or it could be that there was staff in the senator's office that would need to consider these documents or the drafts. They weren't a finished product. They were not an announcement or a written in form of a speech.
Did you find any information in what you photographed to indicate that there was any surveillance or intelligent gathering being done by the Muskie campaign against any of the other candidates?
No, sir.
Did anybody indicate to you that any of this information was useful in these documents?
I did not discuss it at all with Hunt. And I never had an indication from Reitz that anything was useful. On the contrary, there were complaints, Senator, especially in the early days, that the film wasn't right, that it was fuzzy, that they couldn't read it, that it was upside down, that type of thing. Not many accolades or
Maybe you should have taken a course in photography. I don't know. I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Inouye.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Buckley, did you consider your activities to be political in nature?
Senator, I considered him to be in the political area.
And more specifically, political espionage?
I would accept that term.
Who was your sponsor when you were appointed to your job at OEO?
Senator, I don't think that was a political appointment. I had no sponsor. I had some 4 years experience with the Economic Opportunity Act, and prior to that, some 15 years of investigative experience. I did not have a sponsor. The director knew me. The director asked me to come down. I had refused him on one previous occasion and refused another time to accept an assignment in OEO.
Were you surprised when you were asked to do political espionage?
No, I was not.
When you took the job, did you understand that you would be involved in this type of work?
I had an understanding that what we would attempt, I had no idea that it would result as quickly as it did in that type of access.
I just wanted a bit clearer now. When you took the OEO job,
Oh, I thought you meant the assignment from Reeds. I'm sorry.
Asked to do political
I'm sorry.
espionage.
No, I had no idea, and I wasn't asked to for the previous 4 years.
I'm certain you're aware that the administration was opposed to political activity being carried out by grant recipients of OEO funds, such as those involved in legal services and community action programs.
It has always been a violation of the guidelines.
And I presume as part of your job as chief investigator, you were overseeing complaints about grant recipients being involved in political activities?
Yes, sir.
If you discovered a recipient engaged in partisan political activity, what did you do?
We would submit reports to the Civil Service Commission or to the appropriate program people in the agency.
Now, your activities, your political espionage activities, were carried out during what hours, sir?
Generally between 11 and 12, about once a week, or maybe twice on some weeks.
During the daylight hours?
During the daylight hours.
This is during your working hours, isn't it?
During my lunch hour.
11 to 12?
Yes, sir.
I thought you testified at times there were 8 o'clock in the morning.
I don't believe I did. 8 o'clock in the morning?
Yes.
I don't believe I did.
You didn't think that you were doing political activity while being paid by the federal government?
I didn't think I was violating the Hatch Act, Senator. I would consider it related politically.
So, you don't think there's any similarity between grant recipients carrying out political activity and you carrying out covert political espionage?
I wouldn't draw a distinction. I don't recall many grant recipients that were ever disciplined in any fashion for involving themselves in political activity.
In other words, you feel that the subpoena here is unjustly issued?
I did not say that. I have no idea that such is the case.
How would you categorize your activities? Would you say that it was illegal?
No, sir.
Unethical?
I would not say it was unethical in the terms of election year and in terms of what we were seeking to do.
In other words, you're advising the committee that political espionage is an acceptable practice?
Senator, I think political espionage goes on all the time. It has gone on for many, many years. I don't feel that I invented it. I know of instances where 5 or 6 trained investigators have conducted surveillances and have participated in national elections. I expect that kind of thing.
I'm certain you did not invent political espionage, but does that justify carrying out political espionage?
I don't feel that I need a justification. Someone may differ with me on that. I don't feel that I have to justify responding the way I did to a request from Ken Reeds.
It was absolutely proper as far as you're concerned.
As far as I'm concerned, it was, Senator.
And in response to Senator Talmadge's question, you didn't feel that it was larceny on the part of you and Mr. Wyatt in photographing documents without proper authority?
I don't feel that it was larceny. I don't know of any particular statute that would cover that.
If some person photographed government documents, would you consider that larceny?
I'm not sure that I'd consider it larceny. It has been done, and I'm not sure that larceny is the way they proceed on it. Theft of government property, if they took a photograph, I'm not sure.
would you
usually take the
consider
documents.
Would you consider the interception of communication or the invasion of privacy as being illegal, immoral, or unethical?
Senator, I don't consider candidacy for the President of the United States a private matter. I don't consider that we were invading a privacy in that regard. I think it's public. Candidates expect there will be investigations of them and their activities, and I think candidates expect that there will be attempts to ascertain what their activity is and what their position on issues is.
Do you think we should make a few changes for the next election?
Senator, if there's to be legislation that will deal with political espionage, it will be quite complex. I wouldn't have no idea how you could prohibit it, describe it, and then enforce it beyond that. I think it's done in every election, the 3 or 4 that I have knowledge of, and before that and beyond that, others.
Would you consider wiretapping as illegal?
Do I consider it illegal? Yes, sir. Yes.
Did you think that Mr. Wyatt's activity was legal?
Mr. Wyatt's activity?
Yes, sir.
I think it was.
Under false pretenses, intercepting communication was legal?
Well, I don't know what the false pretenses statutes say. He certainly represented himself to be a volunteer, a deceptive, certainly. He did many things beyond what he did that were in the nature of service, and he continued on beyond April doing those services for Senator, for the Muskie campaign.
I thank you very much, sir.
Senator Weicker.
I wasn't quite sure, Mr. Buckley, when you said you felt you had a lawyer-client relationship with Mr. Leonard as to what you're referring to. I thought your attorney is with you here.
My attorney is with me here. The question was asked whether I had discussed with Mr. Leonard my situation, and I, at that point, stood on privilege.
Wasn't the relationship between you, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought the relationship between you and Mr. Leonard was one of employer and employee.
Senator, there was a time when I went to Mr. Leonard and sought counsel on matters involving my involvement in 1971 and 72.
All right. Have you ever met Mr. Caulfield?
No, sir.
Well,
excuse me, I have, Senator. I had dinner with John Caulfield in the White House in 1969, purely as a third party to a dinner between Caulfield and a friend of mine. That one occasion I met him.
Did this relate to the campaign?
No, sir.
This was strictly a personal meeting between...
Personal meeting between Caulfield and my friend, and I was asked to come as a...
You had not known Mr. Caulfield prior to that?
No, sir, I haven't met him before or since.
Mr. Ulasewicz?
No.
Now, you say you received some $7,000 to $8,000, possibly $7,000, possibly $8,000 for the duties that you performed and others performed at your direction. Was any of this reported by you in your tax returns?
No, sir.
And did you report any of the money in the form of withholding or Social Security insofar as the money that you passed on to others?
No, sir.
So it's been totally unreported, this amount of money, is that correct?
It's unreported. I wouldn't have considered reporting it as income, certainly, and I don't think I'm required to report it as expenses. I don't report per diem expenses.
Have you given to the committee a detailed list of your expenses in this matter in relationship to the monies received?
Not a detailed list. I've been over the ground with the staff on 2 or 3 occasions, much in the same manner that we have today.
Now, I wasn't quite clear in my mind as to your explanations of the investigations in West Virginia and in North Carolina. Were these investigations that you were conducting in the capacity of working for the House Committee on Education and Labor?
No, sir. This was 1964, and I was a private employee working as an investigator for 4.5 months in West Virginia. I have a record of the investigations in the form of news clips. I'd be more than anxious to put those in the record if the committee would consider it.
This was in what capacity?
This was as an investigator for the Republican candidate for governor.
In West Virginia?
Investigating irregularities of a previous administration.
I see. All right. Now, your investigation in North Carolina, in what capacity was that?
As a personal friend to the Republican, as a personal favor to the Republican candidate for governor on 2 isolated instances, I looked at 2 things that concerned him in North Carolina.
Now, I've got, I'm going to be reading here from a memorandum that was sent to the Attorney General by Mr. Magruder. It's dated January 31st, 1972. First, let me ask the question, were you at that time, on the 31st of January 72, engaged in the surveillance operation on Muskie?
Yes, sir.
This memorandum states the attached information has come to our attention recently regarding Senator Muskie's campaign organization, signed Jeb Magruder. Now, I'm going to ask you whether or not any of the items which are identified here are items which you recall seeing during the course of your activities. 1, Senator Muskie has received an invitation from a Mr. William G. Mullen, General Counsel of the National Newspaper Association here in Washington, D.C. The invitation is for the Senator to appear at their Washington Government Affairs Conference on March 16 to 18. They note in their invitation they take a great deal of pleasure in the Senator's introduction of S-2965, the so-called Truth in Government Act of 71.
I don't recall that.
2, Senator Muskie has been invited to speak at the 1972 convention of the Young Democratic Club of Wisconsin. The convention is scheduled for March 17, 1972 at the Wausau Midway Motor Lodge.
I do not recall seeing that.
3, Mr. Frederick Merrill, House Office Building, 1422 Washington, D.C., has contributed to the Muskie 72 campaign.
No, sir.
4, Mr. Wally Bowman, President of the Polish National Alliance of the United States of North America, Council 203, Washington, D.C., supports Senator Muskie and made a personal contribution to his campaign. His address is 5119 Temple Hills Road, Washington, D.C.
I have no knowledge of that.
Mr. Norman Heinerfeld, Executive Vice President, Kaiser Roth Corporation, 640 Fifth Avenue, New York. New York is a contributor to the Muskie campaign.
I have no knowledge of that.
Mr. Sam Harris, 120 Broadway, New York, New York, is a generous contributor.
I have no recollection of that.
7, Mr. Jerry Magnan, 1900 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 2010, Los Angeles, California, is a generous contributor to the Muskie campaign.
I have no knowledge of that.
8, Senator Muskie received a letter from Senator Thomas Eagleton, who wrote to him as chairman of the Democratic Policy Council's Committee on Human Environment for the purpose of inviting Senator Muskie to put forth specific suggestions from him or his staff for the 72 Democratic platform. Enclosed with the correspondence was an outline which says that the suggested format for platform suggestions should be double-spaced, and it goes on to give the detailed number of words, etc. Does that
I have no recollection of that.
9, Mr. Frank S. Bernard, 222 South 24th Street, P.O. Box 487, San Jose, California, has contributed $1,000 to the California Citizens for Muskie campaign.
I have no knowledge of that.
And 10 letters, and this is last, letter to Senator Muskie from Robert Oken, financial consultant, Lincoln Avenue, West Orange, New Jersey. It's my expectation that additional funds can be available within 30 to 45 days, and she'll send them along to you through Harold Grant, end of quote.
I have no
You have no
recollection
knowledge
of
of any of those
No, sir.
types of documents.
No, sir.
And only in the most general way do you recall the matters that you photographed and turned over either to Mr. Reitz or to Mr. Warren.
That's right.
And in no case were any of the matters that you turned over related to financial contributions?
Not to my recollection, Senator.
All right, I'm almost through my questioning here. Just two more questions. Can you be more specific and tell me about other instances, other presidential elections, senatorial elections for that matter, gubernatorial elections, aside from your West Virginia work, where espionage of the type that you were engaged on occurred? You keep on referring to this as the basis for...
As a common practice?
Yeah.
Well, I certainly can recall, and the committee is aware of the 1960 election.
I beg your pardon?
The 1960 presidential election.
And you have some personal knowledge there?
I have done some investigation in regard to that election.
Investigation of the election, of individuals in the election. Was this going on during the election, or this is an investigation after the election's over with?
I have been investigating in recent weeks the activity of several trained investigators in the 1960 campaign of Kennedy versus Nixon.
Well, who's authorized you to do this investigation?
Who authorized me to do it? I'm doing it for a local law firm.
Which law firm?
Leonard and Cohen.
Now, let me get this straight. You are investigating the work of investigators who investigated the 60 campaign?
No. I'm investigating the activity of investigators that worked in the 60 campaign. In
And
espionage type political activity.
Oh, I see. But now you say you're doing this at the present time, so obviously this wouldn't be a justification for the actions which you took during the course of the 72 election. I mean, I gather you were motivated, you justified those actions at the time on the basis of knowledge that you had that similar practices were employed in other elections.
On the basis of my feeling that political espionage or political intelligence gathering, political fact gathering, political information is done as a matter of course in elections, as a matter of practice.
Well, I want the specifics. I want the
You want
specifics.
particular elections?
I want the specifics that you had in hand when you launched on this type of work in Senator Muskie's campaign. This was the basis, you told me. This is what justified your
I have
doing
the specifics of 1960 and I have the specifics of 1964, if those are specific. And a general feeling that it's done in all elections.
And this was of your own personal knowledge?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'll end the questioning just with a comment that, and I'm sure the committee will go into this further, Mr. Buckley. Mine's a very small state, but to the best of my personal experience, it doesn't go on. And since we're here in front of the public, I think we better get both points of view out on the table. And quite frankly, I think the people of Connecticut, and I think the attitude is shared by most other people in this country, don't think it should go on. I've heard a great deal of generality. As to all these instances of the types of thing which you were engaged in. I've heard very little in the way of specifics.
Senator, at the conclusion of campaigns, these things are forgotten. Frequently, people who are involved in gathering intelligence on other part sit and talk about them and enjoy them in later years. I served on a very partisan committee in the House of Representatives for 4 years, and there was intelligence gathering and spies in each of our camps. We expected it. When we detected it, we tried to plug it.
You mean there were spies on the committee?
Democrat versus Republican, yes, sir.
Well, tell me about it now. Give me an example.
I'll give an example. In 1967, when the Rules Committee was considering the Economic Opportunity Act, we had drawn a list of 50 questions for the Republican members on the House Rules Committee. Our office was invaded and that list was taken, and we found out the next day that Democratic staff had our list of questions. Congressman H. Allen Smith ran an investigation on that, and we did not discover who took them. Another time I attended a speech, a lecture by Saul Alinsky in a local church with one of the congressmen on our committee. Staff on the other side of the committee took our pictures at that lecture, hoping to get the congressman and I, or particularly the congressman, in a picture with Saul Alinsky to show that the congressman, I suppose, was a liberal congressman, or that he was an Saul Alinsky sympathizer, or now these are facts of life. I think that these things happened, and when I could, I would try to ascertain what the position of the Democrats would be on a controversial bill such as the Economic Opportunity Act.
And these were the thoughts that were running through your mind when you agreed to go ahead and spy on Senator Muskie's campaign?
Really, I didn't think about those things at all. When I was asked to do this, it did not occur to me that I should analyze it or that I should turn it down. I thought it was a very natural and easy thing to accomplish.
That it was a natural thing to spy on Senator in an election.
Natural to me, Senator.
Well, you know, sometimes I tell you, when I go back to Connecticut, I think the whole world's been turned upside down by what seems to be natural around this town. But I suggest you get out of Washington, D.C., because it isn't natural to the people of the state of Connecticut, and I'll let the other senators speak for themselves. I've got no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Montoya.
Mr. Buckley, how long were you a member of the FBI?
13 and a half years, Senator.
When you entered the FBI, did your qualifications as a lawyer play an important part in being admitted?
I think it was a requirement at that time.
Right. And when you left the FBI, you went to work for a committee in the Congress. Did you work with that committee as a lawyer?
No, sir. I worked with them as an investigator to start.
And how long have you been a member of the bar?
I've been a member of the bar for 21 years.
Have you practiced any law at all?
No, sir.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you pride yourself in being a member of the bar? Do you take great pride in being a member of the bar?
Senator, I avoid pride when I can. I was happy when I passed the bar.
Do you feel an obligation to your profession, ethically?
I certainly do. I would if I were practicing law, I'm sure.
Well, now do you feel that you have an obligation as an individual to your profession irrespective of whether or not you are practicing law?
I don't know what obligations I had to my profession. I pay my dues and I observe what I consider to be a reasonably ethical existence.
Now, you admitted a few minutes ago that you were engaged in political espionage.
Yes, sir.
That's what you called it.
That's what all people call it. I don't argue with that term at all.
And that this political espionage was designed to aid one of the candidates for president.
Designed to aid his committee, yes.
All right. Now, you also stated that while you were doing, while you were engaged in political espionage, that you were an employee of the Office of Economic Opportunity.
Yes, sir.
And were you carrying out these activities during the day?
I was carrying them out during a period of 11 to 12 on 1 or 2 days a week.
On 11 to 12 and
11 in the morning till 12 noon on 1 or 2 days a week.
Why did you pick that hour?
That hour was picked by the people that were sending the box from Muskie campaign headquarters.
And that's when you would take your lunch?
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. And did you do this continuously without fail?
There were many days
at the particular hour.
There were many days, Senator, that I could not arrange to meet the taxi cab driver. There were many days that he did not go in. There were many days that he was accompanied by other members of the Muskie committee staff, and that would preclude our meeting.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that did you feel that because you were undertaking this task during your lunch hour, so-called lunch hour, whether it be 11 to 12 or 12 to 1, that you were then acting properly and not violating the Hatch Act as an employee of the United States government?
No, I don't relate the two, Senator. I have never been uncomfortable with the quid pro quo between the government and me. I've been with them 25 years. I think they did well by me, and I think I did my work for the 25 years. Now, the Hatch Act, I think, is a different question. It wasn't because it was 11 to 12. I didn't think that activity is covered by the Hatch Act. I don't think it's spelled out in the Hatch Act.
Well, in what way is it different then?
I don't think they're the same thing. I think they're apples and pears. In one way, that I'm satisfied that I wasn't using any government time or any government resource to meet this man at 11 o'clock. And on the other hand is the Hatch Act, and I don't feel that I was in violation of the Hatch Act for different reasons.
Now, I'm going to read you the one of the canons of ethics that governs the behavior of lawyers and their responsibility. It's Canon EC 1-5. A lawyer should maintain high standards of professional conduct and should encourage fellow lawyers to do likewise. He should be temperate and dignified, and he should refrain from all illegal and morally reprehensible conduct. Because of his position in society, even minor violations of law by a lawyer may tend to lessen public confidence in the legal profession. Obedience to law exemplifies respect for law. To lawyers especially, respect for the law should be more than a platitude. Do you feel that this provision applied to you?
Senator, I have no problem with that provision. I see nothing illegal in the activity that we've been talking about that went on from September 71 to April 72.
Then you stated a few minutes ago that Mr. Wyatt, who was the courier for these documents, was engaged in some kind of deceit.
I would be comfortable with the word deception. I think deceit's a little something different.
All right. Now, would you say that he was engaged in an act of dishonesty?
I would not say that.
Well, wasn't it dishonest of him to transfer some of these documents to you temporarily when he was working for the Muskie campaign?
I wouldn't term that dishonest.
What would you call that? Disloyalty?
I'd call it political espionage.
And you don't feel that political espionage has some elements of dishonesty in it?
I think it has elements of deception. I don't think it has elements of dishonesty. I don't think anything was taken. I don't think any doors were broken down. I don't think that any rubber gloves were used. I don't see any theft involved.
Do you feel that there was any fraud involved?
I think there was fraud involved.
All right. Then I will read you some of the items of misconduct that would constitute unethical conduct on the part of a lawyer. I read from DR 1-102. Engage in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. Now, you participated in this act with Mr. Wyatt, as you have stated. Now, would you think that your behavior constituted unethical conduct on the part of a lawyer?
Senator, number one, I wasn't acting as a lawyer, and number two, I don't think that this involvement fits the section you just read. If you're talking about fraud and dishonesty, I think you're talking about something different, something illegal.
Then I'll ask you this question. Don't you think that the Code of Ethics governing the legal profession applies to all lawyers 24 hours a day? irrespective of whether they are practicing the profession or not?
Senator, I think the general standards certainly would apply to all lawyers. I don't know about 24 hours a day, whether or not they were practicing.
Well, do you think that you would remain in the legal profession as a licensed member of the bar if you violated any particular act involving a felony?
Yes, sir.
You think you would remain as a member of the bar?
No, I think I'd be disbarred.
All right.
I misunderstood your question.
And by the same token, if you violated any of the other canons, you would be subject to disbarment, would you not?
I would be if they were in violation and if they were substantial.
All right. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bacon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. SRS 60, which created this committee, Mr. Buckley, provides that we'll inquire into presidential campaign activities for 1972, as that conduct may relate to illegal, unethical, or undesirable conduct, or words to that effect. It is clearly limited to 1972. There was extended floor debate on the Senate floor about whether the resolution should be amended to extend beyond 1972, and that resolution was not so amended. So we're dealing with 1972. But it seems to me that we have a problem here. If we're going to go beyond illegal and into unethical or undesirable, which are value judgments and highly subjective in their nature, we need a benchmark. I'm not sure that you can decide in the abstract that a particular course of action is unethical or undesirable on the face of it, that it must need a benchmark or some basis for comparison. And that may lead us beyond 1972. That may lead us some years behind 1972. And I make that preliminary statement because I want you to fully understand why I'm asking the next line of questions that I'm about to ask. It is in no way calculated to circumvent the mandate of the resolution which created and conferred jurisdiction on this committee, but rather to serve as some further guide to this committee in making those value judgments on whether certain conduct is undesirable or unethical as distinguished from illegal. Mr. Buckley, you entered into considerable colloquy with Senator Weicker about the particularities of certain instances of political espionage in previous campaigns. And I entirely and wholeheartedly agree with Senator Weicker when he observed that he's heard a lot of generalities but not many details. And that troubles me because I, too, have heard many witnesses come here and say that, well, it's done all the time. Or even some who suggest, well, a defense against certain matters that have been adduced in this record would be that the Democrats did it too. And you may be assured that's not what I'm searching for, but I am searching for some basis for comparison. But going back to the very excellent question put by Senator Weicker, we can't do with additional value judgments or subjective analyses. We need facts. Now, if you have particular and important and significant facts which go into the makeup of the political community's concept of what is unethical or undesirable, or what's routine and regular, what's done all the time or what isn't done all the time. If you have some information about that, I, as one member of the committee, would like to have it, not as a prolonged exposition of the alleged misconduct or poor judgment in other campaigns, but on that question, what is the standard of conduct in politics in America? And you haven't given us much so far. You've given us a little. But if you care to add to that, I'd be, as one member of the committee, be happy to hear it.
I'm sorry that I haven't given you more specifics than I have. I don't think people, prior to this committee's hearings, were conscious that political information gathering was a violation of anything, and I don't think any effort's been made to document any of that or to challenge it.
As I pointed out in my statement just a moment ago, we're mandated as a committee to inquire far beyond the violation of statute law, but to inquire also into conduct that may be illegal, may be unethical or undesirable. Now, if that's so, if there was a general opinion in the political community, if I may use that phrase, that gathering information in a surreptitious way, as you put it, political espionage, was the normal and ordinary thing to do, or even not unusual. I'd like to have, as Senator Walker would, additional facts that would back that up. That's an observation that I often hear, but the record is bereft of any real substantiation of that claim.
I understand, and I'm not in a position to document other instances of it in 72 or in previous years.
Well, I suppose if we were trying a lawsuit at this point, counsel would probably try to qualify you as an expert witness and say, notwithstanding your absence of particular information, based on your total reservoir of experience, do you have an opinion? I'm not certain I want to qualify you as an expert witness, but if we were trying a lawsuit, that's probably what would happen. That would be the next step. Together, you've already testified that it is your impression that was the common practice in politics, to gather information surreptitiously or secretly or deceptively. Is that correct, Mr. Buckley?
Yes, not totally. I think there are many ways to gather information about the opposition's activities and positions that are not surreptitious. The usual case, and I do know of some going back to 64, is that a volunteer within an organization for some reason is disgruntled or malcontent, and she goes to the other opposition and said, do you know what my boss is doing? Or do you know where he's going to be?
Characterize that. Say a secretary gets disturbed about her boss's position, a candidate, her boss's position on a particular issue, and decides to go to the other side and give the other candidate, the opposition, a whole raft of information, confidential and otherwise. Is that?
I think she's a spy.
Well, is that illegal?
Probably not.
What do you think it ought to be, Mr. Buckley? I happen to think it should be, and I'm struggling for some way to define that. But if it's going to be illegal, we're going to have to describe it with some precision. But what is your value judgment? Do you think that example, the young lady who is a secretary who thinks that her boss is on the wrong track and she decides to convey information to the other side, ought that to be a violation of statute law, in your opinion?
I think it would be extremely difficult to spell that out to cover all situations that could arise.
Well, do you think it's undesirable?
I think it is unfortunate. I think it's a fact of life, and I think we'll have it with us.
Well, let's think about the fact of life for a minute. We're all aware of our imperfections, but we all also are aware of an effort to try to improve on it anyway. Even if it is a fact of life, does it have to be a fact of life? Can you give me any help in that respect? Let me put it the other way. Do you think it's desirable that that sort of thing happen? I'm speaking still of the example you gave us of the secretary who decides to spill the beans to the opposition without money, without coercion, voluntarily, if you please. But is that a desirable
Senator,
thing?
I don't think it's desirable. I think it happens in the political arena. I think the books are filled with it happening up on Capitol Hill of employees that have gone to the press and have gone to the authorities, and I think the executive branch downtown is loaded with it. I think the spies that walk around Washington and the executive departments today number thousands.
How are we going to do anything about that? Do you have any suggestions?
I have no practical way to stop this type of thing.
First, you come up against a fundamental constitutional guarantee of freedom of speech and the right to exercise the franchise. While we're not dealing directly with a vote, we are possibly dealing with the question of to what extent one may engage in political activity according to the dictates of his or her own conscience. Mightn't it be a matter of conscience that someone would decide that they owed a responsibility to disclose certain information, assuming that it was not statutorily classified?
I'm sorry, I can't help. Desirable maybe, but practical, I question it.
So I think what you're telling me is that the transference of information, secretly or surreptitiously, for whatever motive, is, in your opinion, a common and routine thing not only in politics but in government.
In politics and government and business. And business
you can't give us any help on how we stop it.
No, you find them and dismiss them.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you get into this thicket, and we get into it regularly in the Congress, that is, deciding that something is bad, but something a little less is probably not illegal, and the next step beyond that is probably not even immoral. But when we get into these shadings of gray, when we get into them, it's the congressional technique usually to move up or down that spectrum and to draw a line and say, well, arbitrarily, we're going to decide that beyond this point you will not pay us. If we adopt that time-honored and traditional congressional technique, could we start out by saying that it ought to be illegal to engage and pay agents for the sake of serving the purposes of political espionage? We could do that. We could say it's an unlawful occupation.
I suppose you could. Then you'd have to spell out what constituted the illegality involved.
Well, that's true. And might we go on to the next step? That gets you into another band of the spectrum where the grays are equally undifferentiated. Could we agree that it should be unlawful to surreptitiously gain documents without the knowledge of the owner of those documents, to photograph them and deliver them to the opposition?
That would be specific, and I think it would be a violation of that statute if you pass it.
What do you think we ought to pass it?
I think that would cover that situation. I don't know how you're going to cover the other 100 situations that come up.
I don't either, but I'm looking for that line.
That would cover that one.
Yeah, well, is that high enough? Is that high enough up the ladder so you think it'd be worthwhile?
I can only answer yes.
You know, politics has taken a bum rap. I'm a politician, and my father before me, my grandfather before me was a politician. My mother was a politician, a member of the Congress. And I've always held, and I still hold, politics in high esteem. I think that I have not exaggerated view of the citizen responsibility to serve, maybe not all your life, but to serve. And I think of the early patriots who did serve for a while and then go back to farming or quarrying limestone or whatever they did, or practicing law. But politics, that is citizen participation in politics, is going to continue to take a bum rap if we leave this business of everybody deciding that's the way it's done, that's the way it always happens, and that's what's going to be because nobody's going to do anything about it. I'm not tongue-lashing you, Mr. Buckley. I'm thinking out loud. How can you suggest, in view of your experience and familiarity with this subject, how can you suggest that we change that attitude and perception of politics? Surely we can begin with political espionage. Surely there's a way to do that. Can you give us any other enlightenment? What else ought to be illegal? What else would help make it not the ordinary thing?
I would make a distinction between the kind of thing we're talking today and the kind of things you've talked about in past weeks, dirty letters and accusations of immorality, that kind of thing. I don't think that they belong in the same bag of tricks at all. And to start with political espionage, I'm not sure that I see that would be illegal.
Of course, you can go across the whole range of considerations in political espionage. You can talk about hiring a taxi cab driver to gain documents that are going to be photographed and turned over to the opposition. You can talk about the situation of printing scurrilous literature about one candidate or the other, or fomenting demonstrations, promoting people to demonstrate either peacefully or violently, carrying signs that are unflattering. Where do you draw the line in there? Can you legislate against those things or give us any suggestion on where they fall on the spectrum of political concern?
No, sir, I can't.
Well, how are we going to go about this, Mr. Buckley? Would you agree with me that politics is taking a bum rap, that we got to do something about it?
I would agree with you. I hope I haven't inferred that there's anything per se dirty or dishonest about politics and that it isn't an honorable pursuit.
Then how are we going to make it more honorable?
I think you've been doing a job for the past 3 months.
Talking about the example that we may create as a result of these hearings in the minds of the public.
Yes, sir.
We have mixed reaction to that. I've had witnesses say that that may be the greatest contribution of the committee. I've heard others say that it probably will cause the public to drop out of politics and disillusionment. So that coin, like most coins, has two sides. But we are a legislative body, the Congress and the Senate and this committee. And while public information, an example, is one of our legitimate implied powers, if I may use an executive department phrase, as one of our implied powers, it's not our principal obligation. Our principal obligation is to recommend legislation. And I gather you are not in a position to recommend any specific legislation that we might take account of in our report.
No, sir, I don't feel qualified to.
Mr. Buckley, you brought forth a document, a book, it would appear, in the course of your testimony, which I've never seen and know nothing about, but my curiosity won't permit me not to ask you what it is.
Senator, this is a series of news clips, news stories in the 1964 gubernatorial campaign in West Virginia.
The 1964 gubernatorial campaign?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'd like to go into that, but I don't think now, if you please, Mr. Buckley. That's
you're welcome to it, and you may have it for as long as you like.
Obviously not within the scope of the committee's jurisdiction, except to the extent that it relates to the political mores, and I won't ask you to produce it then.
And Senator, pardon me, I certainly agree this is not within the scope of our investigation. This committee is not authorized to investigate all the evil that's occurred in the world.
Well, you know, Senator Aiken of Vermont remarked to me one day when I went to the Senate floor and apparently looked haggard and tired, and he patted me on the shoulder as only Senator Aiken can do, and he says, "Howard," says, "don't despair. There's a great reservoir of evil in the world, and you're not about to exhaust it." And I'm sure we aren't. You know, Mr. Chairman, if I can think out loud in connection with this witness's testimony for just a moment, and then I'm through my inquiry. I think it's true that the mandate of this committee does not extend beyond 1972, except to the extent that I've suggested. That is, how do we evaluate the subjective quality of immoral or undesirable as distinguished from illegal? But when we finish this record, I have an idea that the committee ought to give some thought to certifying relevant portions of our record to the standing jurisdictional committees of the Senate, who are not limited to 1972, to look further into matters that have been made to appear or have developed from our investigation, because the fact that things weren't all sweetness and light in 1972 doesn't mean we ought to close our eyes to what happened in other elections. That's all I have at this moment, Mr. Chairman.
You say that you think it's all right to do some of the things you did because they've been done in times past. And I have to say that on this point, the other members of this committee, in interrogating you, have assumed that you're an expert in political activities, and in consequence have asked you certain hypothetical questions. I will probably succumb to the temptation to follow that example. As an expert on political matters, do you think it is honorable conduct for a committee charged with responsibility for electing a president to use campaign funds received by it for that purpose to employ persons to bug and burglarize the headquarters of an opposing political party?
To burglarize and what else, Mr. Chairman?
Bug and burglarize.
My answer would be no.
Now, I take it from I infer from your testimony that you think it's all right and quite moral to undertake to sabotage the campaign of a person seeking a presidential nomination or election by spying upon his activities, by carrying out of his headquarters documents relating to his campaign and photographing them, and transferring the photographs to other persons in charge of a campaign of opposing party candidates. Is that right?
Senator, you use the word sabotage. I don't think sabotage applies to this situation. I think it's
will you accept the word disrupt instead of sabotage and answer the question?
No, sir, I'll not accept the word, because I think you have had a lot of testimony before this committee that did constitute sabotage and did constitute disrupt. I had no intention, and I don't think at any time we disrupted the campaign of Senator Muskie.
Well, that was what you're trying to do, weren't you?
No, sir, we're trying to, I think a candidate is within his rights to gather intelligence on the opposition. I think that the method that he gathers it certainly makes a difference. Penetration and infiltration of an opposition's campaign headquarters, trains, that type of thing, I don't see anything illegal about those or anything disruptive or sabotaging.
Well, do you see anything immoral anything immoral in deception?
In deception?
Yes.
I don't see the degree of immorality in deception that I do deceit or sabotage or disruption.
Do you see any do you see any immorality in lying?
In lying, sir?
Yes.
I'm sure there is.
Well, didn't you lie to Senator Muskie's organization by telling them that you were supporting him?
I didn't. Maybe the taxi cab driver did, but he also told him that he would do errands for him and take his suits to the cleaners and take his baggage to the airport and all of those things he did.
Yes, and assist you in taking his words off of pieces of paper and giving them to his political enemies. He agreed to that too, didn't he, the taxi driver?
You know, I wouldn't consider them political enemies, Mr. Chairman. I'd consider them opposition. I don't consider.
Well, we've had some evidence here about some people who are considered public enemies, which is rather astounding to me. Well, anyway, you can't emulate Adam's example and put your sins off on the taxi driver. As a matter of fact, the taxi driver didn't do anything except what you conspired with him to have him do, did he?
I have no problem with it conscience-wise, Mr. Chairman.
You have no problem with a conscience?
Sir.
Well, you consider you have a tender conscience or a callous conscience?
I consider I have an active conscience.
An active? Does it have any activity except that activity which results in stultifying itself?
I don't know how to respond to that question. The end justifies the mean, that type of thing? No.
You don't believe that?
No, sir.
Well, how did you perform all of these things you had to perform with the connivance of the taxi driver? In other words, here you took the papers temporarily out of the possession of the Muskie campaign organization and photographed them surreptitiously, and then returned the papers to the Muskie campaign organization and delivered the photographs of the words on those papers to the committee to re-elect the president, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Well, I don't know whether that's larceny or not, but evidently the Department of Justice considered it to be larceny when they instituted the prosecution for stealing the words of the Pentagon Papers against Ellsberg.
I don't
There might be some technicality that keeps it from being legal larceny, but it certainly constitutes moral larceny.
He stole the papers and they were classified.
Yes. Well, these papers were private, weren't they? You took some of them. Didn't you rifle through Senator Muskie's mail, open his mail?
No, sir. Not once.
Well, you read his open mail that you saw, the letters, the prepared letters.
I'm not sure I read Senator Muskie's letters.
Well, how many documents did you take out of his headquarters and photograph and then return the documents to his organization and give the photographs of those documents to the committee to re-elect the president?
Several.
Several. Would that be 50 or 60 or 70 or 100?
I wouldn't be able to estimate at all accurately. I would say dozens, 2 or 3 dozen.
You reckon it was that little?
Senator, I'm sorry, I have no idea how many there were that were involved.
Well, you, from your testimony, is it fair for me to infer from your testimony that you've been engaged in politics a long time?
No, sir.
How long have you been engaged in it?
I've been acquainted with the political area since 1964. Not much, if any, before that.
That's a 10-year period.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell this committee a single thing you did in that 10-year period to purify politics?
To purify politics?
Yes.
I would hope that some lessons learned in West Virginia have purified politics down there a little bit since 1964.
That's not what you did. That's what somebody else did, you say.
I did all the legwork on it.
I know, but you investigated somebody else.
Right.
I'm asking you about your activity in politics other than your investigations. What you did to help the committee to re-elect the president and what you've helped other committees to do to elect persons to office. In other words, can you name a single concrete contribution you made in your 10 years of political life to the purification of the political process?
No, sir.
Well, you know, if you take your theory that what has been done, that evil done in the past justifies doing evil in the present.
That's not my theory, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that was, well, maybe it's not your theory, but it's the excuse you gave this committee for your actions. And
my theory is that a candidate has a right, and it's proper for him to gather intelligence on the opposition, and I expect it's done in most, if not all, campaigns.
Well, I've never been in a campaign where it's done so far as I know, and I've been in a campaign since 1922.
And you never had any intelligence on any of your opponents?
No, not whatever, except what I get out of the newspaper.
Okay.
Well, I refuse to accept the theory that because there have been murders and larcenies in every generation, murder has become meritorious and larceny has become legal.
That's not my theory, Mr. Chairman.
Well, where do you draw the line between where your theory operates on a less scale than that?
Well, I certainly can draw the line between murder and larceny and anything that I was involved in.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Any further questions from anybody?
Chairman, just in a few last questions here. As I understand it, then, you don't feel that you caused any disruption, but you would admit that what you were engaged in was spying.
Yes, sir.
Spying, that's the word.
Spying is the word.
Well, let me just make one comment here. It being the football season, you can throw that out, but I'll tell you it isn't coming through my side of the line, and I mean it. How about the public record? Don't you think that's a fair place to draw the line? That anything that is a matter of public record is fair game in the course of an election?
I think that's research. I'm sure there's much of that done.
And that anything that isn't anything that is not a matter of public record falls into this very area that you were engaged on?
Much of that was public information.
Well, if it was public, what you were engaged in, if it was a matter of the public record, you don't have to use aliases and photograph things in taxi cabs and have plants. I mean, that you weren't interested in the public record. You were interested in that which was not on the public record. Is that correct?
Senator, I didn't have any design when I started this. I had no idea what would evolve from it. What I was interested in is what I was asked to do, itineraries, position papers, staff lists, that kind of thing.
But you weren't interested in the public record. You were interested in that which was not available through normal channels to the public.
I'm not sure that I was. I didn't give it that much thought.
Is this the first time that you ever recruited a spy to work in a political campaign?
Yes, sir. I had a couple in West Virginia, and there were a couple in my camp.
I'm asking, is this the first time that you have recruited
Yes, sir.
a spy to work in a political campaign? Is this the first time that you have conducted this type of an operation where you received papers from the spy, photographed them, and turned the results of your work over to a particular individual or political committee? Is this the first time that you've done that?
Senator, as far as politics go, it's the first time. I have conceived and successfully penetrated the Communist Party, the Ku Klux Klan, the Mafia, and the hoodlums in Washington, D.C. with plans similar to this. The mechanics of it is always the same.
Well, I mean, we're not putting Senator Muskie in that category now, are we?
No, sir, but
right.
we're talking about...
all right, but this is the first time that you have done this in a political campaign.
Yes, sir.
So that this committee now has your statement, and those that are privy, which is the whole country, to our discussion, that this is the first time that you have done this type of activity.
No, it's not. 1964 I did it. In 1964 I fired a couple of people who were doing it to me.
These types of activity, I thought your answer to me was this is the first time you've recruited a spy to work in a political campaign.
Well, if that was my answer, I'll retract it and say that there was some of it in the 1964 campaign.
That you did?
I had people reporting to me that were working for the Democratic candidate for governor. And he had my people reporting to him.
So this was done not only in the Muskie campaign by you, in other words, first-hand knowledge, as far as you're concerned, but also you did it once before, which was in 1964.
That's right.
And these are the two instances when you have engaged in this type of activity.
Yes, sir.
Any others where you have done this type of activity?
Any others? No.
And so on the basis of your two experiences, everybody does it. Is that right?
I didn't say that, Senator. I say it's common that political intelligence gathering and political espionage is carried on in most political campaigns.
Well,
and in many
I'm
times,
interested in your first-hand knowledge.
Well, all right.
In your first-hand knowledge, you've done this twice in the course of your lifetime in government and politics.
Yes, sir.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? Unfortunately, is witness coat, though.
Mr. Chairman, the witness who would follow Mr. Buckley, which is Mr. Michael McWinaway, his counsel, Mr. Frank Haddad, was grounded in Louisville, Kentucky, and is unable to get to the committee room until about 4 or 4:30, and therefore we are unable to produce a witness after Mr. McWinaway at this time.
Before I excuse you from further attendance, Mr. Buckley, I'm constrained to make the observation that I'm somewhat intrigued by your statement that that deception is different from dishonesty.
I think I made a distinction between deception and deceit.
Well, Noah Webster didn't know about that distinction when he wrote his dictionary.
I think Larry Brown's a deceptive back, but I don't think he's a deceitful back.
The committee will stand in recess till tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
Well, as we saw, John Buckley didn't budge an inch in his position that espionage and intelligence gathering is part and parcel of the American political process. Well, is it? And if so, to what degree is it? These and similar questions have very elusive answers, as Senator Baker in particular emphasized in his questioning of Mr. Buckley. But despite their elusiveness, I'm now going to pose some of them to our guest expert for the evening, Mike McClister. Mr. McClister trained as a political scientist at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, is president of Baker and McClister Associates, a political consulting firm here in Washington. This firm advises candidates in the planning and running of political campaigns, and as such, they've worked on campaigns at all levels in Tennessee, Ohio, New York, Maryland, Missouri, California, and many, many other states. All right, to begin with, Mike, the obvious question. John Buckley says that espionage is routine in American politics. Do you agree with him? Is it routine? Does everybody do it?
Jim, I don't think so. I think it's an aberration. I think it's an exception when it happens. I don't think it's routine at all, and I just disagree totally with what Mr. Buckley said.
Okay, now, are you making a distinction between espionage and intelligence gathering? Now, you're not saying that you don't want intelligence on the opposition.
No, we often try to get as much intelligence through research about the opposition, about the candidates, as you can. But the things he was talking about, planting people in opposition headquarters, general espionage of that type, trying to become couriers for candidates, I don't think that's done very much in American politics.
All right. Why is it not done? Is it not done because of the great ethical standards of people in politics, or is there some other reason?
Well, I'd like to say yes to that, but that really wouldn't be fair. I think it's not useful, really. It's too easy, I think, when you talk about espionage and sort of the James Bond-type atmosphere that Mr. Buckley, I think, would have us believe prevails in American politics, that there is value to the type of information you might be able to get in that way. You know, obviously there is information that could be helpful. If we could get a copy of a budget of an opposition candidate showing where certain outlays are going to go, how much for television, this and that, a copy of a poll. But that's not the kind of information that you get from low-level volunteers being planted in a campaign headquarters. So.
What about the kind of information that Buckley said, as an example, that he was getting out of the Muskie stationery box, itineraries, drafts of speeches, this kind of thing?
Well, I would question their value. I think Mr. Reitz did by his actions, since he started showing up late for the appointed drops or whatever.
All right, fine line time here now. Let's say that you, Mike McClister, not necessarily as you as an individual, but you, the symbol of the professional in politics, working in a political campaign, a person walks in, this question was raised in the hearing today, but a person walks in and says, look, I'm for your man, McClister, and yet the opposition has just offered me a nifty job in their campaign headquarters. And would you like for me to go ahead and take the job with the opponent, and I'll get all the information I can, and I'll funnel it to you on a regular basis? What would you say, or what should be said in that case?
Well, that is a hypothetical situation. I don't think that would occur. Fortunately, I haven't had to face that one. I don't think I could live with it ethically to pay a double agent.
No, I'm not suggesting payment.
Oh, I see. He's just going to bring me information.
Mm-hmm. Just a good guy who wants to help you.
Again, Jim, I don't really think it would happen.
Mm-hmm.
But if he brought the other guy's poll, I think I'd look at it.
All right. The question that Senator Baker raised, take it down to the next step, where the person doesn't come in and volunteer to be a spy, but it's somebody who worked for the opposition that has seen the light and is now in favor of your client and says, look, I have been the secretary to the campaign manager of your opponent. I know the polls. In fact, I have a copy of the poll. I have the complete budget. when that person walks in, would you say, get out of here, get out of my sight, that's immoral for you to even offer that sort of thing? Or is in the real world, would people I'm not saying you personally now,
Sure.
but in the real world, would the professional say, let me see, I'll be glad to look at the poll and the
Sure.
information?
In the real world, the professional would say, let me see it. Because that professional is in there because he believes in his candidate. And I suppose you could argue that the Secretary seeing the light is our candidate getting the message across.
I see. Well, Mike, what are we talking about then? It's just the way the information is gathered. That's where you have to draw the line. It's not the information itself. In other words, you would say that you would want the poll, but you wouldn't want anybody to break in and get it, right?
Right. I think these are tough questions, Jim. I think in most practical situations, the information we would get about an opposition candidate is acquired in very dreary and very dull ways, research, voting records, this kind of thing. As the value of espionage, I question its practice. It's being carried on because there really is no value to it generally in most campaigns. I probably should note that presidential politics is sort of a different kind of politics. It's a world of its own. Mm-hmm. And because the press has almost 100% attention on presidential politics all the time, the small things are magnified, you know. I've been in campaigns where we couldn't get volunteers. You know, an infiltrator might be accepted even if we knew it. Just to
get somebody to answer the phone.
Yeah, get a mailing out or something.
Yeah. What about this interesting thesis that that Buckley raised, which was that, and one of his defenses for doing what he did was that, after all, Edmund Muskie was a candidate for President of the United States. Nothing that he does is private, including his papers, and that this was a justification for gathering intelligence information, even the methods that he used to do it.
No, I couldn't accept that. A candidate, just like a football coach or anybody else, I think should be allowed the privacy and the right to plan to make the best use of his money and time, his position papers, etc., in strategic ways. I think politicians and candidates, particularly for president, are really public property, and they are under scrutiny. But I think President Nixon defends the confidentiality of the president. I think you could easily defend the confidentiality of a candidate in preparing a campaign.
As a professional who runs campaigns, what is Watergate going to do? Are we going through a clean period, do you think, from this point on, or at least for a while?
Well, we're going through a period, Jim, where all the candidates want to be non-politicians now. I think in the first election after the hearings started, a candidate ran for office with the slogan, you should elect me because I have never been in or near politics. And so the honest, quote, candidate, or the candidate who emphasizes the fact that he is not a politician, is going to be in vogue, because there's a presumption that incumbents, people who've been around, connected with politics, which unfortunately has a very, very low reputation right now, are going to be in trouble.
Republicans and Democrats, right?
I think so. I think you can apply it to incumbents generally. I think obviously Republicans are probably going to be a little more hurt than Democrats right now.
Sure.
But I think the whole system's hurt.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McLister. All right, tomorrow's lineup will include more witnesses in this dirty tricks field. Beyond that, the committee is again juggling its schedule. And Peter Kay has learned that the future may include some big names from the campaign of 1972.
The Watergate Committee this week, for the first time, will investigate charges of Democratic dirty tricks in the 1972 presidential campaign. In effect, the senators will be following on the testimony of one of their star witnesses, H.R. Bob Haldeman, the former presidential chief of staff, who mentioned this whole incident last summer. Haldeman had charged that participants in a demonstration against President Nixon in September of 1972 were recruited from his opponent's Los Angeles headquarters. Fred Tower, the California coordinator for the McGovern for President campaign, will be questioned by the senators about use of phone banks in the McGovern headquarters to recruit those demonstrators. Before Tower, the committee is scheduled to hear tomorrow from Michael McMinoway, also known as Sedan Chair 2, an alleged spy in the camp of Hubert Humphrey, another Democratic candidate. Then the senators are scheduled to hear from some really big names in the campaign organization. Clark McGregor, who headed the committee to re-elect the president, Burl Bernhardt, who was Senator Muskie's campaign manager, and two high McGovern campaign officials, Frank Mankiewicz and Gary Hart. The dirty tricks phase will be interrupted for 2 weeks when the senators recess, from October 12th to 29th. This means the committee will go beyond its original November 1st deadline, and even after that, we're scheduled to hear 2 or 3 weeks of campaign financing testimony. Jim?
All right, we'll be back tomorrow night with Mr. McMenaway's testimony. Until then, for our guest, Mike McClister, and for Impact and Peter Kay, I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
From Washington, you've been watching gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of the hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. This program was made possible by grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation. This has been a production of NPACT, a division of the Greater Washington Educational Telecommunications Association.